The prosecutor held up the photograph like it was holy evidence, like it was the undeniable truth that would send a man to his death. "This is what gang violence looks like," he told the jury, his voice heavy with practiced outrage. "This is what Marcus Williams did to an innocent store owner." The image showed a body slumped behind a counter, blood pooled on linoleum floor, a crime scene so brutal it made jurors look away. What the prosecutor didn't mention, what he actively hid, was that 3 witnesses had seen the real killer. That the murder weapon had fingerprints that didn't match the defendant. That Marcus Williams had an alibi supported by 4 people. That the detective who'd built the case had a history of coercing confessions from innocent suspects. None of that mattered, because Marcus was black, poor, and had the misfortune of living 3 blocks from where Vincent Chen was murdered during a gang-related robbery. Because the real killer was a protected informant for the police. Because the city needed someone to convict, needed to show they were tough on gang crime, needed a face to put on their war against street violence. So they chose Marcus Williams, a 23-year-old community college student who'd never been arrested, never been in a gang, never hurt anyone. And on November 17, 1995, a jury that deliberated for less than 6 hours sentenced him to death. This is the story of 28 years stolen by a system that values conviction rates over truth. Of a man who maintained his innocence while the world called him a liar. Of a journalist who risked her career to investigate a closed case. Of a retired detective who couldn't live with what he'd helped cover up. Of families destroyed on both sides, the Chens, who believed justice had been served but would learn they'd been lied to, and the Williams family, who knew their son was innocent but couldn't prove it. It's about gang members who kill without consequence while innocent men rot in prison. About prosecutors who hide evidence because losing a case is worse for their careers than convicting the wrong person. About a justice system so broken that proving innocence is harder than establishing guilt. And about the morning when the truth finally emerged, not through the courts that had failed, not through the appeals that had been denied, not through the system that had imprisoned an innocent man for 3 decades. But through the confession of a dying gang member who couldn't take his secrets to hell. What would you do if the system convicted you for someone else's crime? If your alibis were ignored? If evidence of your innocence was buried? If every appeal was denied, every lawyer told you to accept a plea deal, every day brought you closer to execution for a murder you didn't commit? Marcus Williams spent 10,220 days asking himself that question. Living it, surviving it, this is his story. And it's a story about every innocent person currently sitting in prison, waiting for a justice system to admit it made a mistake it's institutionally designed never to acknowledge. The murder happened on August 3, 1995, at Chen's Corner Market, a small grocery store in South Los Angeles that served a neighborhood where poverty and gang activity had created a war zone that the media covered only when the violence spilled into wealthier areas. Vincent Chen, 62 years old, had owned the store for 18 years, knew his customers by name, extended credit to families when they needed it, was beloved by everyone except the Eastside Crips who'd been demanding protection money for the past 6 months. When Vincent refused to pay, told them he'd rather close the store than finance gang violence, they made an example of him. The shooter walked in at 9:47 p.m., face partially covered by a bandana, gun already drawn. The security camera captured everything: the brief conversation, Vincent's hands raised in surrender, the shooter's casual execution of a man who'd done nothing except refuse to be victimized. 3 shots to the chest. Vincent collapsed behind the counter. The shooter grabbed $187 from the register and walked out, disappearing into the night that had swallowed thousands of similar crimes in neighborhoods where murder clearance rates hovered around 30%. 3 witnesses were in the store, customers who ducked behind shelves when the shooting started. All 3 gave nearly identical descriptions to the first officers on scene. Black male, approximately 6 feet tall, thin build, wearing a red bandana associated with a specific Crip subset, distinctive scar on his left cheek, tattoo visible on his neck. None of these details matched Marcus Williams, who was 5'9", stocky, had no scars or visible tattoos, and was at his girlfriend's apartment 12 miles away when Vincent Chen was murdered. Detective Raymond Torres caught the case the next morning, arriving at a crime scene already cold, witnesses already traumatized, evidence already contaminated by the dozen officers who'd processed the scene overnight. Raymond was a 20-year veteran, known for high clearance rates, respected by prosecutors who loved how his cases always came with solid evidence and confessions that held up in court. What they didn't know, what wouldn't emerge until years later, was how Raymond achieved those impressive statistics. By deciding who was guilty and then building cases backward, shaping evidence to fit conclusions rather than following evidence to truth. He looked at Vincent Chen's body and saw a gang execution. Looked at the neighborhood and saw the East Side Crips territory. Made a logical assumption. This was retaliation for non-payment of protection money, committed by gang members who operated with impunity because witnesses were too terrified to testify. Raymond needed a suspect who fit the narrative. Needed someone the jury would believe was capable of this violence. Needed a face to attach to gang crime. He found Marcus Williams through the kind of police work that looks reasonable on the surface but reveals its corruption only when examined closely. Marcus lived 3 blocks from the store, had been stopped twice in the past year during gang sweeps, not arrested, not charged, just stopped because he was young and black in a neighborhood where that was sufficient reason for police attention. His name was in the gang database, flagged as a possible associate, based on nothing except geography and the fact that his cousin, whom he barely knew, had been arrested for drug possession. To Detective Torres, this was enough. Marcus fit the profile, lived in the area, was the right age and race, could be presented to a jury as a gang member even if he'd never been in a gang. So Raymond brought him in for questioning. The interrogation lasted 11 hours, conducted in a windowless room where time became meaningless and exhaustion eroded judgment. Raymond used every technique he'd learned in 2 decades of extracting confessions: isolation, intimidation, false promises, fabricated evidence. He told Marcus the witnesses had identified him, which was a lie. Told him his fingerprints were on the murder weapon, which was false. Told him that cooperating now would mean leniency, which was impossible given the capital murder charge. Marcus, 23 years old, terrified, exhausted, without a lawyer present because Raymond had convinced him that innocent people don't need attorneys, maintained his innocence for hours. Said he was at his girlfriend's apartment watching television when the murder occurred. Provided her name, her address, the names of 3 other people who'd been present. Raymond dismissed all of it, said alibis from girlfriends and friends meant nothing, said the evidence was overwhelming, said Marcus could either confess and show remorse or go to trial and face the death penalty. At hour 9, Marcus asked for a lawyer. Raymond ignored the request, a constitutional violation that should have invalidated everything that followed but somehow didn't. At hour 11, Marcus, broken by exhaustion, terrified of execution, convinced by Raymond's lies that he was already convicted, said something that would destroy his life. Maybe I was there. Maybe I don't remember. I was high a lot back then. It wasn't a confession. It was the desperate statement of an exhausted man trying to reconcile the impossible contradiction between his knowledge of his innocence and the detective's absolute certainty of his guilt. But Raymond treated it as an admission, ended the interrogation, wrote a report that transformed Marcus's equivocal statement into a full confession. Never mentioned the 11-hour duration, the denied lawyer request, the fabricated evidence used to pressure the suspect. The actual evidence told a different story, one that should have exonerated Marcus immediately. The security camera footage showed a shooter who didn't match Marcus's physical description: taller, thinner, different build entirely. The fingerprints on the murder weapon, recovered from a dumpster 2 blocks away, belonged to someone else. A match in the criminal database to Leon Trigga Johnson, a known East Side Crips enforcer with 3 prior convictions for armed robbery. The 3 witnesses, when shown photo lineups, didn't identify Marcus. 2 pointed to different suspects. 1 said none of the photographs matched the shooter. Marcus's alibi was solid. His girlfriend Shanice confirmed he'd been at her apartment, corroborated by her roommate and 2 friends who'd been watching a pay-per-view boxing match. Phone records showed Marcus had called his mother from Shanice's apartment at 9:52 p.m., 5 minutes after the murder, from a location 12 miles away. None of this evidence made it to the jury. The security footage was deemed too poor quality to be conclusive, despite clearly showing the shooter's build. The fingerprint evidence was dismissed as possibly contaminated, even though it was a perfect match to a known gang enforcer. The witness identifications were characterized as unreliable, because gang members intimidate witnesses, a circular logic that assumed Marcus was a gang member without proving it. The alibi witnesses were discredited during prosecution cross-examination as biased friends and family lying to protect a murderer. And Marcus's exhausted, coerced, completely involuntary statement was presented as a full confession, proof of guilt straight from the killer's mouth. The trial was a performance, not a search for truth. The prosecutor, Amanda Vance, was running for district attorney and needed high-profile convictions to demonstrate she was tough on crime. Vincent Chen's murder, a hardworking immigrant killed by gang violence, was perfect for her campaign narrative. She presented Marcus as a remorseless gang member, introduced evidence of his association with criminal elements based entirely on where he lived and who his distant relatives were, argued that his presence in a gang database proved his character. The defense attorney, a public defender named Thomas Reeves handling 6 other capital cases simultaneously, was overwhelmed and underfunded. He failed to investigate the fingerprint evidence adequately, didn't hire an expert to analyze the security footage, never tracked down Leon Johnson to question why his prints were on the murder weapon. He presented the alibi witnesses but didn't prepare them for the prosecutor's aggressive cross-examination. He objected to the confession's admission but couldn't articulate the constitutional violations clearly enough for the judge to exclude it. The jury, shown a photograph of Vincent Chen's body, told that the defendant had confessed, assured by the prosecutor that gang violence required harsh responses, deliberated for 5 hours and 43 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. The sentencing phase took less time, 3 hours before they recommended death. Judge Patricia Morrison, who would later be censured for multiple cases of judicial misconduct but faced no real consequences, accepted the recommendation and sentenced Marcus Williams to execution by lethal injection. At 23 years old, Marcus became one of the youngest people on California's death row, convicted of a murder he didn't commit, sentenced to death based on evidence that should have freed him. Death row at San Quentin State Prison is designed to break human spirits, to reduce people to their worst moments and force them to live in that reduced state until the state kills them. Marcus arrived in January 1996, processed through intake procedures that stripped away everything except his conviction, placed in a cell measuring 4.5 feet by 11 feet where he would spend 23 hours a day for the foreseeable future. The psychological torture of death row isn't the execution itself, it's the waiting, the appeals process that stretches across decades, the hope that appears and disappears with each court decision, the knowledge that the system has already decided you're disposable and is just following bureaucratic procedures before disposal. Marcus watched men lose their minds, watched them attempt suicide, watched them give up, waive their appeals, volunteer for execution because death seemed preferable to decades of waiting for death. He refused to break, spent his single hour of daily yard time exercising, maintaining physical health because it was the only thing he could control. Used his limited phone privileges to call his mother, his sister, maintaining connections to a world that was forgetting he existed. Educated himself through the prison library, reading law books, studying his own case, searching for the errors that would overturn his conviction. The first appeal was filed in 1998, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel, constitutional violations during the interrogation, prosecutorial misconduct in hiding exculpatory evidence. The California Supreme Court denied it in 2001, a cursory decision that basically accepted the trial court's findings without serious examination of the issues raised. The second appeal, filed in 2003, focused on new DNA testing technologies that could potentially exclude Marcus. Denied in 2006 because the prosecutor argued the evidence had been lost during routine evidence disposal, a claim later revealed to be false but by then legally irrelevant. The third appeal, 2008, presented affidavits from 2 of the original witnesses recanting their testimony, admitting they'd been pressured by Detective Torres to say they weren't certain about their identifications. Denied in 2011 because recanting witnesses are considered unreliable, their new testimony less trustworthy than their coerced original statements. 28 years passed in this cycle of hope and denial, appeal and rejection, Marcus maintaining his innocence while the world moved on. His mother died in 2007, never seeing her son freed. His sister Angela became his only regular visitor, making the 6-hour drive from Los Angeles to San Quentin once a month, sitting across from him in the visiting room trying to maintain conversation about a life he wasn't part of. She never doubted his innocence, never stopped fighting, spent years contacting advocacy organizations, journalists, anyone who might investigate a case the courts considered closed. Most ignored her, some were sympathetic but overwhelmed. There were thousands of questionable convictions, limited resources, no way to investigate them all. Angela refused to accept this. In 2018, she contacted Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist with the Los Angeles Times who'd written extensively about wrongful convictions and police misconduct. Sarah almost dismissed the case. She received dozens of letters from family members claiming innocence, most without merit. But something in Angela's letter caught her attention. The detail about Leon Johnson's fingerprints on the murder weapon, evidence that should have been exculpatory but had been excluded from trial. Sarah made a phone call to the Los Angeles Police Department requesting the case file under California's Public Records Act. Was told the file was sealed pending ongoing appeals. Made another request specifically for the evidence log. Was told evidence had been destroyed in accordance with retention policies. Made a third request for Detective Torres's personnel file. Was told that was confidential. These refusals, the institutional resistance to transparency, triggered Sarah's investigative instincts. When agencies fight this hard to hide information, there's usually something worth hiding. She spent 6 months navigating bureaucracy, filing formal complaints, threatening lawsuits, eventually obtaining partial case files through a combination of legal pressure and connections with sympathetic sources inside the department. What she found was stunning. The security camera footage still existed, stored in an evidence warehouse that was supposed to have disposed of it years earlier. The fingerprint analysis on the murder weapon was far more conclusive than the trial record suggested, a 12-point match to Leon Johnson, enough for certain identification. Reports from 2 of the 3 witnesses stating they didn't recognize Marcus in the photo lineup, documents that should have been provided to the defense but weren't. And most damning, internal affairs complaints about Detective Torres, multiple incidents of evidence tampering and witness coercion, a pattern of misconduct that the department had known about and covered up. Sarah contacted Leon Johnson through his attorney. He was serving a life sentence for an unrelated murder committed in 1998. She expected denial, expected a gang member to protect his reputation by refusing to admit to crimes. Instead, Leon, dying from liver cancer with less than a year to live, agreed to talk. What he told her would unravel everything. Leon had killed Vincent Chen, a hit ordered by his gang's leadership as punishment for refusing extortion. He'd disposed of the weapon in the dumpster where police later recovered it. He'd heard about Marcus's arrest, had been relieved someone else was taking the fall, had assumed the justice system would eventually figure out the mistake and release the wrong man. When that didn't happen, when Marcus was convicted and sentenced to death, Leon felt something he'd never experienced before, guilt. Not for killing Vincent Chen, which he still viewed as gang business, but for allowing an innocent man to be executed for his crime. Sarah asked the obvious question. Why confess now, after 28 years? Leon's answer was simple and devastating. I'm dying. I'm going to hell, but I can't take this with me. That man on death row didn't kill nobody. I did, and every day he sits there is on me, on Detective Torres who knew the truth, on that prosecutor who cared more about winning than justice, on a system that don't give a fuck about whether they got the right person as long as they got someone. Sarah recorded the confession, verified details only the real killer would know, documented Leon's account against the evidence. Then she contacted the Los Angeles County District Attorney's office with a request that should have been simple: review the Marcus Williams case in light of new evidence. The initial response was dismissive. Convicted criminals claim innocence all the time, death row inmates file endless appeals, the case had been thoroughly litigated and the conviction was sound. Sarah pushed back, sent the confession recording, sent the fingerprint evidence, sent the documentation of Detective Torres's misconduct, sent the witness statements that had been hidden from the defense. The DA's office response came 3 weeks later. They would oppose any motion to overturn the conviction. The evidence was inconclusive. Leon Johnson's confession was unreliable testimony from a convicted murderer. The fingerprints were possibly the result of contamination. The hidden witness statements were immaterial because other evidence supported the conviction. In other words, the system was defending itself. Admitting Marcus was innocent meant admitting the prosecutor, the detective, the judge, the jury, the appeals courts had all failed. Meant acknowledging that California had spent 28 years preparing to execute an innocent man. Meant opening the door to civil liability worth millions. Meant destroying the careers of people who'd built reputations on this conviction. So they refused, denied reality, chose institutional preservation over truth. Sarah published her investigation on March 15, 2023, a 15,000-word article that methodically dismantled the prosecution's case, presented Leon Johnson's confession with corroborating evidence, exposed Detective Torres's pattern of misconduct, and asked a question that made readers physically uncomfortable. How many innocent people are in prison right now, convicted by a system more interested in closing cases than finding truth? The response was immediate and explosive. The article went viral, generating millions of social media shares, protests outside the Los Angeles courthouse, national media coverage. Civil rights organizations filed an emergency motion demanding Marcus's immediate release. Legal experts called the conviction one of the most egregious miscarriages of justice in California history. Vincent Chen's widow, Mrs. Chen, now 78 years old, read the article and experienced something that shattered her understanding of the previous 28 years: doubt. She'd believed justice had been served, that her husband's killer was in prison, that the legal system had worked. Now she learned she'd been lied to, that the man she'd wanted executed was innocent, that the real killer had been free for years before being imprisoned for a different murder. She called Sarah Chen, no relation, just the coincidence of a shared surname, and said something that made the journalist cry. "I want Marcus Williams freed. My husband's real killer needs to be held accountable. I was told that already happened. I was wrong. Please help make this right." The pressure became overwhelming. The governor, facing re-election and unable to defend a conviction that had become a national scandal, ordered an independent review. The Los Angeles County DA, realizing the political cost of opposing the obvious truth, reversed position and joined the motion to vacate the conviction. On September 8, 2023, 28 years and 1 month after his wrongful conviction, Marcus Williams walked out of San Quentin State Prison a free man. The hearing had lasted 17 minutes. The prosecutor admitted there had been irregularities in the original investigation. The judge vacated the conviction and sentence, and just like that, Marcus was no longer a condemned murderer but an exonerated innocent man. He stood outside the prison gates at 51 years old, having entered at 23, having lost his entire adult life to a system that couldn't admit its mistakes until forced by public pressure. Reporters surrounded him, asking how he felt, what he'd do next, whether he was angry. Marcus's response was measured, careful, the words of a man who'd learned that emotional reactions could be weaponized against him. "I'm grateful to be free. I want to thank everyone who fought for me, especially my sister Angela and journalist Sarah Chen. I forgive the people who did this because holding anger won't give me back the years I lost. But I want the system to change. I want Detective Torres held accountable. I want prosecutors who hide evidence to face consequences. I want this to never happen to anyone else." It was a statement of impossible grace from a man who had every right to rage, to demand vengeance, to burn down the institutions that had destroyed his life. The settlement came 8 months later. California agreed to pay Marcus Williams $47 million in compensation, approximately $1.67 million per year of wrongful imprisonment. The largest wrongful conviction settlement in state history. It couldn't return his 20s, 30s, and 40s. Couldn't bring back his mother who died believing her son was a murderer. Couldn't restore the relationships, the career, the life he should have had. But it was something, an admission, however inadequate, that what happened to him was wrong. Detective Raymond Torres was never charged with any crime related to Marcus's conviction. He'd retired in 2010 with full pension, his pattern of misconduct buried in confidential personnel files that wouldn't be revealed until Sarah Chen's investigation. When contacted by reporters after Marcus's exoneration, Raymond expressed no remorse, said he'd followed proper procedures, blamed his superiors for any failures in the case. He died in 2024, age 73, having faced no legal consequences for the role he'd played in destroying an innocent man's life. Prosecutor Amanda Vance, who'd used Marcus's conviction to win her campaign for district attorney, served in that position from 1996 to 2008 before being appointed to a judgeship. When asked about the wrongful conviction, she issued a statement saying she'd relied on evidence presented by investigators, and had acted in good faith based on information available at the time. The California State Bar declined to pursue disciplinary action, ruling that prosecutorial decisions made decades earlier couldn't be evaluated by current standards. She remains a judge, still making decisions about people's freedom, still trusted by a system that has never held her accountable. Leon Johnson died on February 3, 2024, his liver cancer finally overcoming his body. His confession had freed an innocent man but brought him no legal consequences for Vincent Chen's murder. The statute of limitations had expired, and prosecutors deemed it pointless to charge a dying man. His last interview, conducted from his hospice bed, was an apology to Mrs. Chen and to Marcus. "I took 2 lives that night. Mr. Chen's life ended. Mr. Williams's life was stolen. I can't fix either. I can just tell the truth and hope that means something." Mrs. Chen attended his funeral, a gesture of forgiveness that shocked observers but which she explained simply. "Hate didn't bring my husband back. It won't help Marcus recover his years. Leon told the truth when he could have stayed silent. That took courage I have to respect, even though I'll never forgive him for killing Vincent." Marcus Williams today lives quietly in Northern California, using his settlement to fund wrongful conviction advocacy organizations, speaking at law schools about the failures of the criminal justice system, visiting men still on death row who claim innocence. He's rebuilt relationships with his sister, reconnected with Shanice who never stopped believing in him, and slowly constructed something resembling a normal life from the wreckage of 3 stolen decades. But normal is impossible after 28 years on death row. He startles at loud noises, struggles with crowds, Has nightmares where he's back in that 4.5 by 11-foot cell waiting for an execution date. Sees a therapist twice weekly to process trauma that most people can't comprehend. When asked if he's angry, if he hates the people who did this to him, Marcus always gives the same answer. Anger is a luxury I can't afford. It would consume me the way that prison almost did. I choose to focus on prevention, on making sure this doesn't happen to others, on fixing a system that's more interested in convictions than justice. The statistics suggest his mission is nearly impossible. As of 2024, over 2,500 people have been exonerated in the United States since 1989, representing conservatively 25,000 years of wrongful imprisonment. Experts estimate that between 2 and 5% of all prisoners are actually innocent, suggesting tens of thousands of wrongful convictions that will never be overturned because most people don't have an Angela Williams fighting for them, don't have a Sarah Chen investigating their case, don't have a Leon Johnson willing to confess. They simply serve their time or face execution, invisible casualties of a system that measures success by conviction rates rather than accuracy. The real tragedy of Marcus Williams's story isn't just what happened to him, it's that it's not unique, not exceptional, not even particularly unusual in a criminal justice system that incentivizes prosecutors to win rather than seek truth, that rewards detectives who close cases regardless of whether they caught the right person. That makes exoneration so difficult that proving innocence is harder than establishing guilt. It's a story that repeats across the country in different variations. The prosecutor who hides evidence because disclosure might result in acquittal, the detective who coerces confessions because they're evaluated on clearance rates, the defense attorney too overwhelmed to investigate adequately, the judge who trusts police testimony over alibi witnesses, the jury that conflates accusation with guilt, the appeals courts that defer to trial courts even when errors are obvious, the system that protects itself by making admission of mistakes nearly impossible. And at the center of these repeating tragedies are human beings. People like Marcus, like the families destroyed when the wrong person goes to prison, like the victims' families who are told justice has been served when it hasn't, like the real criminals who remain free because someone else took the fall. The system calls this acceptable collateral damage, acknowledges that wrongful convictions happen but argues the alternative, letting guilty people go free, is worse. It's a calculation that sounds reasonable until you're the one wrongfully convicted, until you're Marcus Williams spending 10,220 days in a cell for a murder you didn't commit, watching your life disappear while everyone with power to help you chooses not to because admitting you're innocent means admitting they were wrong. What would you do in that cell? How would you maintain sanity? How would you survive knowing that your innocence doesn't matter, that truth is irrelevant, that the machinery of justice has identified you as disposable and is processing you toward execution with bureaucratic efficiency? Marcus survived by believing, against all evidence, against every denial, against the weight of a system designed to crush hope, that eventually truth would emerge, that someone would care enough to investigate, that justice, however delayed, would eventually arrive. He was right, but only barely, only because his sister refused to stop fighting, only because a journalist took the case seriously, only because a dying gang member's conscience couldn't bear the weight of sending an innocent man to death. Remove any of those elements and Marcus Williams would have been executed, his innocence dying with him, another statistic in a system that would investigate for approximately 45 minutes before concluding the execution was justified based on the original conviction. The ghost unit that hunted Pablo Escobar operated outside the law and called it necessity. Detective Torres operated outside the law and called it police work. The difference is that one was hunting a guilty criminal who'd made himself immune to justice, while the other was framing an innocent man because convicting someone was more important than convicting the right person. Both abandoned procedural safeguards, both made choices that haunt them, but only one resulted in justice, while the other created a 28-year nightmare for a man whose only crime was being in the wrong place with the wrong skin color when the system needed a conviction. That's the lesson of Marcus Williams's story, not that the system occasionally fails, but that it's designed in ways that make failure inevitable, that prioritize efficiency over accuracy, that punish admission of error more severely than the errors themselves. Until those incentives change, until prosecutors face consequences for hiding evidence, until detectives who coerce confessions are prosecuted rather than promoted, until courts value truth over finality, there will be more Marcus Williamses. More innocent people convicted, more families destroyed, more lives stolen by a justice system that's forgotten what justice actually means. Marcus Williams is free now, exonerated, compensated, trying to rebuild. But he'll never get back his 20s. Never get to say goodbye to his mother as a free man. Never recover the life that was stolen from him by people who faced no consequences for their actions. That's not justice. It's just the end of an injustice, which is better than nothing but infinitely worse than justice never being denied in the first place. And somewhere tonight, in prisons across America, there are people in Marcus's old position, innocent, convicted, hoping someone will care enough to investigate, to question, to fight. Most will die in prison. Some will be executed. A few might be exonerated decades too late. All of them are casualties of a system that works exactly as designed, efficiently processing human beings through courts and into prisons, prioritizing speed over accuracy, conviction over truth, institutional preservation over admitting mistakes. That system convicted Marcus Williams. That system almost killed him. That system is still operating right now, still convicting innocent people, still defending those convictions against all evidence because admitting error is more dangerous than perpetuating injustice. Until that changes, the story of Marcus Williams isn't a historical tragedy. It's a preview of the next wrongful conviction, the next innocent person sent to die for crimes they didn't commit, the next 28 years of stolen life that will eventually end with an apology that can never be adequate and compensation that can never restore what was taken. Justice delayed is justice denied. In Marcus Williams's case, justice was delayed for 10,220 days. Better late than never, perhaps. But those days are gone forever, stolen by a system that still hasn't learned the lesson his case teaches. That convicting the innocent is worse than freeing the guilty, that truth matters more than winning, and that a justice system that can't admit its mistakes isn't a justice system at all. It's just another form of violence dressed in legal language and executed with bureaucratic efficiency.